What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. There's a lot of hidden gems here and there that I find when I'm doing research surrounding the development of individual champions in League of Legends, and one thing that I find a decent amount of information surrounding it is actually champion abilities that were maybe scrapped from champions that were released, but also have a very high probability of existing in the future. These abilities don't work out not because they're bad abilities, but because they don't really fit or maybe they don't make sense on the specific champion that they happen to be tested on. And the design team is left with this super awesome ability that they save in order to use it in the future. And there's a lot of abilities like that, and I want to mention that every single ability that I'm going to talk about in this video actually does have some sort of rider that has come out and say that this is something that has a very high chance of existing in the future, which is why these abilities are so awesome, because not only are they super cool, but they're also pretty legit too. And of course, if you guys enjoyed the video, hit that like button, and if you don't, hit that dislike. Anyway, jumping right into our first ability, it's something that was originally tested on one of the original designs for Lux. For those who don't know, when Lux was first announced and was being developed for release, her W actually used to give stealth to her allies. This version of her W was something that was planned for her release during beta, but that version of her kit got scrapped and her release would get delayed, and then Lux would get released a little bit after the beta ended. Now this version of giving stealth to her allies existed on her W, and in that form the ability was super clunky and stuff since it was a skill shot, and a skill shot that targets your allies is honestly kind of just a weird design. However, a writer did comment on this ability and said that given the right type of spell, this sort of concept could totally work out. It definitely would not be a skill shot, but an ability that gives an ally or maybe allies stealth is something that could be super awesome. Maybe we could see it on a support or maybe a jungler, and it could create a new type of gameplay that we haven't seen before, and it's something that we could definitely see happen in the future. The next ability that has a really solid chance of existing in the future is something that was originally planned to exist on Xin actually. So I guess in a way it's maybe a scrapped ability for Aurelion Soul. This ability was described by a writer as something that was a global resonating strike ability. At the time, Xin was a storm dragon type of character using a lot of magic, revolving around creating and manipulating storms and stuff, and this ability would send out a storm cloud in a target direction, which was a global skill shot, and it would mark any enemies hit by it. Xin could then reactivate the ability to dash onto the target as a massive bolt of lightning. And remember, this was global, and it was also on his ultimate, but I imagine this is maybe where the design for Aurelion Soul's E kind of came from, as his Comet of Legend ability is a little bit similar to this one, kind of. I don't know, maybe it's a little bit of a stretch. But the writer who shared this ability also commented on it and said that the ability showed enough promise to maybe be resurrected at some point in the future. So it's definitely something that could be in consideration for a new champion. It would just depend a lot on the character and the design that they are trying to go for with it. The next thing that we have is a little bit more of a general concept rather than a specific ability, but a while back Riot Meddler was talking in his Q&A about how they haven't really made any creatures and champions who were less humanoid. At the time they hadn't, at least. And this was around 2013 or so, and Rek'Sai and a few other champions came out of that discussion as a result, but he also mentioned a bit about the gameplay for those non-humanoid characters, and mentioned that the design team really wanted to make more abilities that involved clickable objects, similar to Thresh's Lantern, and we got that again with Rek'Sai's Tunnels, and we kind of saw this in Alawi as well, but it's quite possible that we'll see another ability on a future champion involve some kind of clickable object that is created that interacts with you, your allies, or your opponents. It's a pretty interesting concept, and I'd expect to maybe see another ability that is clickable by your allies, since Thresh's Lantern is the only ability like that that exists, and there's a lot of design space for that type of gameplay, and we could definitely be seeing it again in the future. Another ability that also has some potential to exist in the future is something that was a scrapped ability on Taliyah. One of the versions of her ultimate when she was in development allowed her to make some chunk of wall just straight up disappear for about 15 seconds or so. You could remove things like the entire Baron Pit wall, walls in the jungle, all sorts of stuff at will, and then you and everyone else could just walk right over them as if the wall didn't exist. This ability was super awesome, but it really did not make sense at all on the kit for a control mage. Control mages are the type of champions who usually want to create barriers and stuff, not so much remove them. However, the design team that worked on Taliyah did talk a lot about how this type of ability could work on maybe a support or some kind of tank. However, they'd have to develop their tech a little bit more before being able to actually put this ability on a champion. I remember for Talia they said that if they actually put this ability in her kit, her release would have been delayed for about 6 months or so, so although it's definitely possible to exist, it would require a decent amount of work, and they did mention that this ability will probably come back one day in some form, but I would consider it to be a little bit less likely than some of the other abilities in this video. Our next ability is one that was inspired by Lissandra's Q, kind of. It was an ability that was suggested by a fan on a forum post, but then a rioter saw it and just talked about it for a little bit. The ability is something that is a skill shot that gets a longer range when it kills a unit, but instead of having an overall set range like Lissandra's Q does, it would theoretically have an infinite range, as long as there were enough units to hit or kill in a row. This kind of ability could be super cool and definitely really fun to play with. Extending the range on something after hitting or killing something, kind of how Lissandra's Q does, sets up some really interesting situations, especially during the laning phase. The writer commented about this ability and said that they actually did mess around with an ability previously that had a very similar concept. It was a skill shot that would deposit an orb at the end of its range, and if that skill shot hit an orb, it would refresh and thus extend the range whenever it passed through. They said that there was a lot of design space for this ability, and I quote, "We'll get one of them in the game eventually." So this kind of ability is almost certainly going to make it into the game. It's definitely a lot more likely than some of the other abilities on this list. And a theoretically infinite but also not infinite ranged skill shot is super cool, and I'm probably excited for this ability the most. The next ability we're looking at is an ability inspired by the design of Yasuo's Wind Wall. This idea of interacting with other abilities while they're in the air is something that the writers said that they would certainly revisit again at some point in the future. This concept of interacting with spells after they've already been thrown out is one that they think is pretty awesome, and it has a really high chance of existing in a different form in the future. It probably wouldn't be something like Wind Wall, since they'd want to mix up the mechanic a little bit and keep the new ability unique, but some kind of ability that maybe interacts with your allies' skill shots, or something that maybe interacts with your opponent's skill shots in a different way than Wind Wall could totally become a reality. I know for the Urgot rework they were testing an ability somewhat similar to this one, of like the J-Skate type of effect that would multiply allied projectiles. And although that ability was impossible to code and broken beyond belief and totally unbalanceable, the concept of maybe buffing your allied projectiles could totally work on maybe like a support or a jungler or something, and it would be a super awesome ability to play with. The next ability is something that had originally been planned to be on Bard. When Bard was in development, the initial design for a character was much more Bard-like in the sense that it revolved around music a lot more. That version of his kit was scrapped for a multitude of reasons, and he would go on to get changed pretty significantly, but one of the abilities that he had in the more musical version of his kit was a passive, where after you auto-attacked a target, it would spawn a skill shot under them, similar to how, kind of like Karthus' Lay Waste. It was like a little skittle kind of thing, which would then detonate after a certain amount of ticks, kind of like how Karthus' Lay Waste detonates after a short delay, but maybe a little bit fancier. And the writers said that this was probably the most successful ability on the musical version of Bard's design. It showed a lot of promise and it was super cool, and Riot Meddler said that it wouldn't surprise him if some variant of this ability eventually ended up on the future kit of a champion. I think this one is super cool. I mean, the idea of an auto attack modifier that spawns a dodgeable skill shot under your opponent is one that totally has a lot of potential and could be super awesome to play with for sure. And for our next one, it's another ability that was inspired by Talia. This one comes from the concept of a fan suggesting that it would be cool if Talia's ultimate dealt damage, or perhaps an ability that pulled up a piece of the ground, but depending on where she was on the map, it would have a different effect. Her Q pulls up rock from the ground, and maybe it'd be cool if you got a different effect from pulling up ground from like the river or the jungle or in a lane or something like that. It's a super cool concept, and the general idea of an ability that interacts with your location or your type of location on the map is one that the designer for Talia said would be super cool, and you wouldn't be surprised if they made an ability like this eventually. Obviously they can't change any of Talia's abilities, but this type of mechanic would be super awesome to work with as like a jungler and could create tons of unique and interesting strategies. And that just about wraps up the list. There's definitely a lot of super cool abilities that Riot may or may not release in the future, and I'm always excited when it comes to champion design and champion concepts, and anything related to their abilities. And it's definitely possible that I'll make a sequel to this video in the future if you guys enjoyed this one. So that's going to be it from me. Drop a like, subscribe if you want. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.